Welcome guys, tonight we travel back, not to the blazing war camps or echoing marble temples you might expect, but to a quiet, rippling meadow just outside ancient Sparta. The wind is light, the grass is warm, and something feathered and a little ridiculous is about to happen. You're lying in the long, sun-dried grass. Bees hum lazily around you, half drunk on lavender, and your sandals are kicked off somewhere behind you. A stream gurgles nearby, catching little dapples of sunlight, and for now, just for now, the gods have left this place alone. But not for long, because high above you in a palace made entirely of cloud and starlight, Zeus is bored again. And when Zeus gets bored, nobody is safe, not even the birds. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and what time it is where you are right now. I love seeing how far this little bedtime history club reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly toward the meadow's center. It's one of those days when the sun isn't hot enough to burn, but just warm enough to make everything smell better. Sweet wild thyme, dusty olive bark. And somewhere in the distance, someone is lazily beating linen against a stone. Sparta isn't what the movies tell you. It's not all abs and yelling. Sure, the warriors are real, but so are the poets, the farmers, the lazy shepherds who spend 3 hours discussing whether goat cheese should be salted before the moon rises. You pass one now. He's snoring under a fig tree, mouth open, a straw hat tipped over one eye. His goat is chewing on a papyrus scroll he probably meant to return to the temple. Past him, the meadow opens wide, flat, golden, and buzzing with sleepy insects. You can see the hills of Mount Taygetus in the distance, their shadows like soft brushstrokes on the land. And above all that sky, ridiculously blue, almost too perfect to be real, which, as it turns out, it is. Because up in that sky, reclining on a pillow made of vapor and smugness, is Zeus, king of gods, lord of lightning, and absolute master of bad decisions. Today, Zeus is feeling artistic. He's already transformed into a golden shower, a bull, and once, a beam of moonlight with suspicious timing. He's trying to outdo himself. Something elegant this time, he mutters. He leans over the edge of Olympus and watches the world like a child peeking into a toy box. His hair sparkles with constellations. His robe is stitched with fragments of nebula. His breath smells faintly of roasted boar and fermented ambrosia. And below, far, far below, he sees you. Well, not you specifically, but someone just across the stream. A woman dressed in pale linen, her dark hair braided in the Spartan fashion, skin sun-kissed and neck tilted toward the sky. She is humming something. Maybe a hymn, maybe nothing. This is Leda, queen of Sparta, wife of King Tyndareus. And without knowing it, she's about to be the answer to a riddle no one wanted. A swan, that's the form he chooses. White, graceful, noble. Still absurd enough to keep the Olympian gossip flowing for decades. Zeus snaps his fingers. Somewhere, a thundercloud yelps. Feathers erupt where fingers were. His divine chest shrinks, his arms twist into wings, his legs bend backward with a crunch, and moments later, he is airborne. And if you've never flown as a god in swan form, well, it's about as dignified as it sounds. You hear the wind first, a low, vibrating whoosh. The meadow darkens slightly, not with storm, but with the sudden shadow of outstretched wings. You glance up and squint. At first, it's just a shape, then feathers. Then a very large, very determined swan makes a slow spiral downward, elegant, theatrical, and definitely aware he's being watched. The air stirs, grass rustles. Your tunic flutters slightly at the hem. You take a step back, not because you recognize Zeus, but because something about this bird feels dramatic. The swan lands, not with a honk or a flap, but with a sort of gentle pose. One wing folded just so. The neck arched in a way that says, "I'm not just a bird, I am the bird." It's ridiculous. You blink, he blinks back. There's a moment of silence, broken only by the soft creak of feathers and the distant thwack of a lazy fisherman smacking a mosquito. Then, across the stream, Leda notices him. She's crouched at the bank, her hands dripping with water, her sandals forgotten in the reeds. When she sees the swan, she tilts her head like someone trying to solve a puzzle that smells vaguely like incense and danger. She takes a cautious step forward. You freeze. Zeus, or Swan Zeus, trembles not from fear but from performance. His wing is tucked against his side as if injured. His eyes flutter half shut. If he had lips, he'd be pouting. He lets out the saddest, most poetic swan sound ever uttered by god or beast. It's somewhere between a sigh and a sneeze. Leda gasps. She moves toward him, splashing through the shallows. You can feel the shift in the air, the way everything seems to lean in. The bees stop humming. Even the goat from earlier looks up, scroll still hanging from its mouth. She kneels beside him. "Poor thing," she murmurs. Zeus blinks slowly. He's trying to look pitiful and noble and casually seductive all at once. Leda reaches out and strokes his wing. Her fingers sink into the down, soft, warm, strangely electric. There's a flicker of something in her eyes. A pause. Now here, where it gets mythologically vague. Some versions say he charms her with divine presence. Some suggest illusion, magic, or the old-school Olympian trick of it just happens because the gods say so. Others, more gently, claim she simply takes him into her lap to comfort him. Historians still argue whether the moment was literal, symbolic, or embroidered by later poets who had way too much wine and not enough editors. But what is agreed upon, strangely, is what happens next. Leda becomes pregnant, and not just in the usual way. No, this is mythology. Subtlety left the building 3 chariots ago. She lays eggs, 2 of them, glossy, enormous, and tucked neatly into her private chambers like oversized wedding gifts no one ordered. And out of those eggs will come 4 children. 2 are divine, 2 are mortal. One will be Helen, yes, that Helen of Troy, of faces that launch ships, of unfortunate consequences. But we're not there yet, for now the sun is lower. The wind has picked up slightly. Zeus has vanished, popped back to Olympus to preen and brag and probably write a terrible poem about his feathers. Leda walks home with a dazed look and water drying on her ankles. Somewhere inside her, myth is already taking shape. And you're still standing in that meadow. The goat snorts. You sigh and follow the queen at a respectful distance, wondering vaguely whether you just witnessed love, deception, or divine bird cosplay. One thing's for sure, Sparta isn't boring anymore. You keep walking behind Leda, careful not to disturb the moment, though truthfully, she barely notices the world around her anymore. Something has shifted, not just in her body, though certainly there too, but in the air around her, in the very rhythm of the day. As she steps out of the meadow and into the outskirts of the palace grounds, the breeze slows. The cicadas fall quiet. Even the sun seems to dim slightly, as if the gods themselves have pulled a sheer veil across the sky to let her walk in peace. The palace is not quite as grand as you might imagine. It's not some towering fortress or marble-covered museum of ego. Sparta prefers practicality. The walls are thick, built of warm, sun-bleached stone. Ivy trails from upper balconies, and the roof tiles glow orange in the last stretch of daylight. You pass under an archway into a shaded corridor. The air here is cooler, carrying the scent of pressed olive oil and wood smoke. Somewhere a lyre is being tuned. Somewhere else a child is shouting about a stolen honey cake. Leda moves like a sleepwalker. She doesn't call for servants, doesn't stop to remove her sandals, doesn't even greet the old handmaid who blinks at her from a doorway. She walks straight through the main hall and into a quieter courtyard, one overgrown with rosemary and pale purple irises. A fountain gurgles in the center. A few birds flutter off as she approaches, startled by her presence or perhaps the strange energy she now carries. She sits on a stone bench, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed somewhere just above the horizon. Now, if this were a modern love story, perhaps this would be the moment she doubts everything. Maybe she questions the bird. Maybe she wonders if she imagined it all in the heat. Maybe she laughs. But this is ancient Greece. The divine and the domestic brush shoulders often like neighbors who keep accidentally sharing mail. So she doesn't question, she simply waits, and then it begins. The first egg arrives quietly. No pain, no labor, just a sudden awareness that something within her has become another. The palace midwife, called hurriedly and not without skepticism, arrives with a bundle of linen and a spoonful of fennel tea. You've seen strange births before. One time a goat gave birth to a loaf of bread during a solar eclipse. Another time a woman screamed for 4 hours before sneezing out a perfect black pebble. But this is new. An egg, large, pale, slightly warm. Leda places it gently in a woven basket. The midwife insists they cover it with wool to keep the embarrassment from spreading. Then a second egg comes. And at that point the midwife simply pours herself some wine and sits down heavily on a stool. You do the same, leaning against a column and watching the flickering torchlight play against the stone. The eggs rest quietly for several days. They do not crack, they do not glow, they simply are you. Right there when they begin to hatch. It's early morning and the sun has barely crested over the rooftops. The palace is still sleeping. Even the guards have slouched a little on their spears. A soft tap breaks the silence, then another. The first egg fractures slowly like a crack spreading across old marble. Then the shell collapses inward and out tumbles a tiny, squirming figure, pink-skinned, wailing, utterly human and utterly not. The second egg hatches moments later. Then the room is filled with movement and cries and the smell of something ancient and sweet, like pine resin and thunder. The children are named later. Helen, Clytemnestra, Castor, Pollux. Historians still argue which ones were divine and which were mortal. The consensus usually lands on Helen and Pollux being children of Zeus, and Castor and Clytemnestra being children of Tyndarus, Leda's husband. But mythology is annoyingly inconsistent on the matter. You hear it all whispered through the palace in the following days. The servants giggle behind clay jugs. The courtiers pretend not to stare at the infants when Leda walks by with her quiet, regal smile. The priests murmur about omens. One particularly ambitious philosopher starts drafting a 700-line poem about the ethics of divine incubation, which unfortunately no one wants to read. And then there's Tyndarus. Now let's talk about this man. Tyndarus is the king, husband to Leda. Technically the father of 4 newborn children, 2 of whom just popped out of goose eggs, and he handles it like a Spartan. He listens to the midwife's nervous account. He examines the eggshells. He stares at Helen for a long, long time. Then he goes into his study and writes a 3-stanza hymn to Hermes about the importance of not asking too many questions in marriage. It becomes an underground hit among married Spartan men. You walk past him that evening. He's sitting in the palace garden, wine cup in hand, staring at a rose bush. He doesn't seem angry, just tired. You sit beside him for a moment and he offers you the cup. The wine is strong and tastes like raisins and smoke. He doesn't say anything for a long time, then he sighs. "I'm not saying I believe she laid eggs," he says. You raise an eyebrow. "I'm just saying if she did lay eggs," he continues, "they're very well formed." He nods as though this concludes the matter and returns to sipping in silence. Later that week, the palace holds a quiet celebration. Nothing ostentatious, just a few wreaths, some roast lamb, a harpist playing old lullabies in the corner. Leda walks among her guests like a cloud drifting between columns. The babies are swaddled and passed from hand to hand. Helen is the smallest, her eyes startlingly blue. Castor and Pollux already squirm like they want to wrestle each other. Clytemnestra grips your thumb with a strength far beyond her weeks. People smile politely. They murmur about destiny. They avoid the word egg, but you hear whispers in the corners. "She was glowing when she came back from the meadow," one says. "I heard the swan still flies above the river," says another. "My cousin's cousin saw feathers in her bed," says a third, before being promptly elbowed by his wife. Days turn to weeks. The children grow quickly. You spend afternoons wandering the palace gardens with them, watching as they chase butterflies and pull apart fig leaves. Helen laughs like sunlight. Pollux climbs things he shouldn't. Castor insists on naming every rock. Clytemnestra watches. She's quiet, thoughtful. Her gaze lingers longer than the others. You feel perhaps she remembers the eggs, maybe even the swan. One afternoon, she walks up to you, places a hand on your knee and says, "Do swans always cry before flying?" You don't know how to answer. That night you lie awake beneath the stars, listening to the wind rustling the fig trees. Somewhere in the distance a bird calls, not an owl, not a nightingale, a low, long cry. You sit up. Far above, against the velvet sky, a single white shape glides across the moon. You smile. Somewhere Zeus is still watching, or gloating, or composing a really bad sonnet about how feathers improve romance. The gods are strange, but then again, so is everything. You turn onto your side, close your eyes, and let sleep carry you back toward the soft golden meadow, the hum of bees, and the quiet flutter of wings. The palace, once humming with whispers and torchlit gossip, has begun to settle into its strange new normal. The babies have grown into toddlers, each more peculiar than the last in their own gentle way, and you spend more time now in the sun-drenched colonnades, watching the drama of divine children unfold in domestic little bursts. This morning, you're lounging near the eastern olive grove, sipping barley water and occasionally swatting a sleepy bee that refuses to understand boundaries. Just beyond the terrace, Helen, barely 4, sits under a fig tree and sings softly to a beetle she's placed. In a laurel crown, the beetle seems confused but accepting of its promotion. Pollux is up a tree again, of course, yelling something about being king of clouds. Castor is climbing after him, less for the glory and more because he refuses to let his brother win at anything. And Clytemnestra, ever composed, is arranging river pebbles by size and color, occasionally glancing toward her siblings like a tax collector assessing unpaid debts. It is peaceful, mostly. But above all this harmony floats a thin thread of tension. Not fear, not even unease, just awareness. Everyone knows these children are not entirely of this earth. And Zeus, he's been suspiciously quiet. You haven't seen the swan in weeks. No strange feathers on windowsills. No celestial rumblings or suspicious cloud shapes. He's disappeared into the misty folds of Olympus again, off to meddle in other mortal affairs. Possibly as a leopard this time, or a breeze. Or an elderly merchant selling suspiciously glittery fruit. But you know better than to think he's forgotten. He's watching. They all are, especially Aphrodite. Now gods have rivalries like mortals have allergies, persistent, irrational, and randomly triggered by the most ordinary things. Zeus's dalliance with Leda wasn't just romantic nonsense, it had implications. Especially for Aphrodite, goddess of love, who didn't particularly enjoy being overshadowed by a bird. You first sense her arrival in the faint scent of roses that suddenly blankets the courtyard. Not fresh-cut petals, but deep, heady bloom, the kind that coils in the lungs and makes everything feel slightly unreal. Then come the doves. Two of them, plump and unusually clean, land at the fountain and begin pecking at the moss in slow, synchronized motions. Then, without so much as a shimmer, there she is, Aphrodite, draped in gossamer threads that defy gravity and common sense. Her hair tumbles like honey, her eyes flicker with the lazy confidence of someone who could end a war by blinking. She glances around the garden with mild interest, as though deciding whether the floral arrangement lives up to divine standards. You rise politely, almost involuntarily. It's hard not to when she looks directly at you. Her gaze is warm, soft, and terrifying in the way of warm, soft fires that will eventually consume your house. "Oh," she says, smiling faintly. "So these are his children." You glance toward the fig tree. Helen has braided the beetle's antennae with time now. Pollux has jumped out of the tree and is trying to wrestle a breeze. Clytemnestra is still organizing her pebbles. Aphrodite watches them all, but her gaze lingers longest on Helen. "So small," she muses, "so loud. You want to say something, maybe to explain." But she lifts a finger and hums a note under her breath. It hangs in the air like a perfume. Suddenly the beetle flies off, spinning drunkenly into the sky. Helen blinks and looks up. Their eyes meet. It's brief and subtle, and the gods will swear later that nothing happened in that moment. But something does. A seed, invisible and slow-growing, is planted. Aphrodite turns to leave. No flourish, no thunderclap, just a soft rustle of silk and the faint sound of sandals disappearing into sunlight. You're left with a strange sense of foreboding. Not dread, just the quiet certainty that the story is picking up speed. That night you find yourself in the great hall again. The fire is low, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Tyndareus sits near the hearth, carving shapes into a plank of wood. He's making toy horses. Simple ones, 2 wheels, rough heads, long tails, a gift for the twins. "You ever wonder," he says without looking up, "what happens when children grow into myths?" You don't answer, because he's not really asking. Helen is asleep nearby, curled into a pile of linens and stuffed toys. You glance at her face and feel a strange shiver. Not fear, not even awe, just a whisper of tomorrow. The next day you wake to find Helen missing. She's not far, only down at the riverbank, the same place Leda once walked barefoot and met the Swan, but the entire palace is in chaos. Servants are running. Soldiers are forming search parties. Leda is still in her bedchamber, sitting bolt upright, her eyes hollow with some premonition she can't name. You get to the river before the others. Helen is there, of course, calm, collecting reeds and whispering to herself. She smiles when she sees you. "Did you know the wind has a name?" she asks. You nod. "Which one?" you ask. "All of them," she says seriously, then returns to her reeds. You walk her back slowly. Later that week, Tyndareus orders a new stone wall to be built around the children's quarters. He stations guards. He speaks with oracles. One particularly dramatic seer begins foaming at the mouth when Helen walks into the room and must be carried out by 3 men. The seer later draws a picture of a flaming bird flying across a sea of black sails. No one knows what it means, at least not yet. Meanwhile, Zeus continues to say nothing. But in your dreams you begin to hear Swan calls again. Low, distant, always from the direction of the mountains. One evening, as you watch the sunset from the highest tower, you see a white feather floating on the breeze. It lands on your hand, warm, buzzing faintly with static. When you blink, it's gone, but the wind carries a whisper. Not done yet. The children grow taller. Their games become more complex. Pollux begins training with the palace guards. Castor gets into trouble for smuggling a goat into the dining hall and insisting it be knighted. Clytemnestra learns how to throw a spear farther than most adult men. And Helen watches, always watching. She memorizes faces, moods, shadows. You swear sometimes she looks at you and knows exactly what you're thinking. The gods begin to visit less often now, but that doesn't mean they're gone. One morning, a golden apple appears in the garden. No one sees who placed it there, but engraved on the side are the words, "For the fairest." No one touches it. Yet you feel the shift again. Like thunder rolling behind the mountains, not loud, not here, but coming. The children sleep soundly. The palace returns to its rhythm. Bread is baked, sandals repaired, spears sharpened. And above it all the stars begin to gather, waiting. You lie down that night beside the courtyard fountain. The moon is silver and low, and the water catches it like a mirror. You remember the swan, you remember the girl by the river. And you know, even without divine whispers or celestial dreams, that this story is just beginning. You wake before dawn, the palace still cloaked in silence, save for the soft clinking of armor far off in the barracks where Sparta's warriors stretch and mutter before their daily rituals. And for a moment, you lie there beneath your thin linen sheet, wondering if the dreams of swans and golden apples were real or just echoes of yesterday's wine. But then you hear it again, the sharp whoosh of wings cutting across the pale sky, and the memory settles in your chest like a smooth stone. You rise slowly, sandals slapping the cool stone floor, and make your way past sleeping servants and flickering oil lamps toward the stables, where the horses snort gently in their stalls, already sensing something in the air, some tension woven into the dawn itself. Outside, the courtyard glows with that soft blue of pre-sunrise, and above, the stars fade reluctantly, giving way to a new day that feels heavy before it even begins. You're not alone for long. Pollux and Castor burst into the courtyard minutes later, still arguing over who won yesterday's race, each carrying a wooden sword and too much confidence for boys their age. They spar noisily, their feet kicking up little clouds of dust, laughter echoing off the stone walls, while Clytemnestra, as usual, watches from a low balcony, eating a pomegranate with the slow, deliberate calm of someone who could end either of their careers with a single well-timed shove. Helen isn't here. You glance toward the upper rooms, the garden, even the colonnade where she often plays with petals or beetles or dangerous thoughts, but she's nowhere to be seen. That's when Leda appears, wrapped in a cloak of heavy wool despite the mild air, her hair down, her expression unreadable, walking with a deliberate slowness that makes your stomach tight. She's not in her bed, she says, softly but without panic, and you both know it's not the first time, nor will it be the last. Together you follow the winding paths through the palace grounds to the riverbank once again, where predictably Helen stands knee-deep in the water, whispering something to the current, her hands raised like a priestess offering a blessing or a warning or maybe just asking the reeds to be still. She turns when she hears you approach, face unreadable, but eyes bright with something that is not childlike. There's something under the water, she says. It sings when I step in. You pause, unsure how to respond, but Leda simply gathers her daughter into her arms and walks back toward the palace without speaking. Days pass, and soon the household is preparing for the midsummer festival, a raucous blend of offerings, races, drunken bards, and questionable goats in ceremonial ribbons. But there's a quiet tension behind the revelry. Tyndareus has received word that suitors are beginning to circle, even now, even though Helen is still barely of age. Gifts begin arriving at the palace, boxes of saffron from Lydia, silk dyed with lapis, statues carved with suspicious resemblance, and the great hall starts to feel less like a royal residence and more like a bridal auction. One day, while walking the southern corridor, you overhear two courtiers murmuring about a prince from Thessaly who's offering a fleet and 2 islands just for a meeting with her. Another has sent a lion, which now sulks in a caged pen by the kitchen, eating goats and scaring the pantry maids. You try to ignore it, but it builds. Everywhere you go, people are talking about Helen as if she were a prize mare or a storm waiting to land somewhere unfortunate. Pollux doesn't like it. Castor pretends not to care, though you catch him threatening a courtier with a stick one morning for saying Helen's hair looked conquerable. And Clytemnestra? She says nothing, but she sharpens her bronze knife every night, the soft scraping sound echoing through the women's quarters like a lullaby for vengeance yet to come. Helen, for her part, seems untouched by the fuss. She walks the halls like a dream, sometimes laughing at nothing, sometimes stopping in the middle of the garden to stare at the sky as if waiting for something that hasn't arrived yet. You ask her once gently if she's nervous about the suitors. "Why should I be?" she says, tilting her head. "They'll all burn for me in the end, won't they?" You blink, she smiles, and walks away. By the time the festival arrives, the palace is overflowing warriors, poets. Kings, strange foreigners in embroidered robes, even a wandering bard who claims he once dined with Heracles, though he also says he's made of bronze, so nobody listens. Helen is seated at the center of it all, adorned in pale blue silk and gold filigree, her hair woven with violets and braided in a pattern said to resemble the constellations above Olympus. She barely speaks. She doesn't need to. Every man in the hall watches her like a hawk. Some whisper, some sweat. One faints and must be revived with fig wine. Tyndareus calls for quiet and begins a long, meandering speech about honor, marriage, and household economics, but no one listens. All eyes are on Helen. You watch too, not because of her beauty, though it is unnerving, but because you see the tiny twitch at the corner of her mouth when a prince drops his wine cup at her feet. She's enjoying this. She's not overwhelmed, she's in control. And that's when you realize this isn't about love. It never was. It's about power. Every man here wants Helen for what she represents, desire, legacy, legend, but none of them truly see her. And perhaps that's the point. She watches them all through half-lidded eyes like a goddess studying insects. When the procession ends and the suitors have paraded their gifts and awkward metaphors, Tindera stands, clearly sweating, and announces that no decision will be made tonight. Groans follow. Someone breaks a lyre, but Helen says nothing. She doesn't have to. Later, as the moon rises and the music fades into drunken snoring, you find her alone on the rooftop garden, barefoot, singing a lullaby in some language you don't know. "Do you think they'd still want me?" she asks suddenly. "If I was just a shepherd girl with muddy feet and bad dreams?" You open your mouth to answer, but she's already walking away, the flowers brushing against her ankles like they belong to her. And far above, beyond the clouds and constellations, something moves. Not a swan this time, but perhaps something worse, because Aphrodite is watching again, and she's smiling. The next morning breaks with gold sunlight pouring in through the carved shutters of the women's quarters, dappling the walls in moving patterns that Helen watches without blinking, lying in bed perfectly still except for her eyes, which track the light like it's speaking to her in some forgotten celestial code. And you're there by the doorway, pretending to dust a tapestry while really watching her. Because there's something different today, something quieter in her, like a lake right before the wind starts to blow. Downstairs, Tyndarus paces. He hasn't slept much since the suitor parade, and neither have the guards, who have doubled their patrols after one particularly sunburned king attempted to bribe a servant boy into leaving his door unlocked with a pouch full of amber teeth. Yes, teeth. Leda, meanwhile, sits in the garden with a spindle in her lap, but the thread keeps breaking, and she keeps glancing toward the horizon, as if expecting thunder or feathers or fate itself to come marching over the hills in broad daylight. You spend much of the day running errands, carrying baskets of grapes, delivering messages between nervous advisors, and once, helping Pollux unstick his foot from a bronze vase after he insisted it would make excellent armor for a surprise attack on Castor, who has now barricaded himself in the granary with 3 chickens and a blunt javelin. Everyone is a little off-kilter. Even the horses are skittish, but no one says it aloud. Instead, they pretend it's just another day, while the whole palace slowly leans towards something it can't see yet. That night, a feast is held, not for celebration, but out of obligation, as if eating roasted lamb and singing songs about long-forgotten river gods will keep the tension from crawling up everyone's spines. The hall is full again, filled with suitors who still haven't given up, though their gifts are now less grand and more desperate. One presents Helen with a mirror made of polished obsidian that supposedly shows your true soul, but when Helen peers into it, she simply smirks and sets it down without comment. Another suitor tries poetry. It rhymes, badly. Even the olive oil weeps a little. Then, in a twist no one expects, Odysseus arrives. Yes, that Odysseus, not yet the war-weary sailor you'll meet much later in Homer's verses, but young, sharp-eyed, and already full of tricks. He brings no gift, no lions, no fleets, just words. "I don't want Helen," he says plainly, while everyone stares, mouths slightly open like confused fish. "But I have a deal to offer." And just like that, the air changes. Because Odysseus, cleverer than half the gods and at least 3/4 of the room, proposes something unexpected, he suggests that all the suitors swear an oath, one that binds them to accept whoever Helen chooses and to protect that marriage with their lives, no matter what. There's silence, then murmurs, then laughter. But Tyndarus sees the logic. He agrees. The oath is sworn that night by torchlight, with spilled wine and bronze daggers and the sort of solemn mumbling that only comes from very tired men agreeing to something they don't fully understand. Helen watches it all from a high seat, chin resting on her hand, eyes reflecting the flames like polished coin. You notice she never speaks, not once, she simply watches. And when the men rise, oath-bound and still arguing about fairness and metaphors, she slips away like fog. The next morning she chooses Menelaus, not the richest, not the loudest, but solid, Spartan, familiar in the way of river stones and sunrise routines. There's no great proclamation, no trumpet or wreath of roses, just a short, quiet nod. And it's done. Menelaus accepts her hand with grace, though even he looks briefly surprised. A marriage is planned, quickly, quietly, as if to prevent second thoughts or divine interference. and the palace throws itself into preparation once again. You help with garlands. The maids scrub the floors until the marble sweats. Pollux and Castor are tasked with entertainment, which translates to an aggressive chariot race through the main corridor that knocks over 3 amphorae and a guest from Rhodes. Clytemnestra insists on choosing the music and ends up threatening the lyre player into learning a new song she wrote herself. It's intense, but the day arrives and it's beautiful. Soft sun, warm breeze, doves circling lazily above the courtyard, and Helen stepping out in white linen threaded with gold, a simple circlet on her head and something unreadable in her eyes. The ceremony is traditional. Sacrifices, libations, vows, everyone smiles, everyone claps. But you standing by the fig tree near the back of the crowd see something else. Aphrodite, half visible behind a column, whispering to the wind. And though no one else seems to hear it, you catch the words, "Let's see what you do with this." You glance at Helen. She meets your eyes just for a second, then looks away. That night the wedding feast rages into the early hours. Dancing, music, honeycakes, wine thick enough to glue your teeth together, and stories told in booming voices about long-dead monsters and glorious battles that probably never happened. But you step outside after the third course, needing air, and find Helen sitting alone near the edge of the reflecting pool, her feet bare, trailing the water. "Do you think they'll still tell this story when I'm gone?" she asks quietly. You hesitate. "Probably," you say. "But maybe not the way it happened." She smiles without looking at you. "Good." The moon glimmers on her skin like dew. You stay with her until the candles burn low and the palace grows quiet again. Inside, the guests dream. Menelaus snores. Castor has tied himself to a tapestry by accident. Aphrodite has vanished. And above it all, the sky waits, just a little darker than before. You awaken to birdsong and the sharp scent of thyme drifting in from the herb garden. But even before your eyes open, something feels different. As if the whole palace is holding its breath, waiting for a whisper or a thunderclap. And as you rise, stretch, and make your way down the stone corridor still warm from the previous day's sun, you hear footsteps, distant and hurried, and realize that news has arrived. In the courtyard, a herald from Thessaly unfurls a scroll with too much pomp for how early it is, announcing that wedding gifts are on their way from a dozen kingdoms, some with gold, some with silver, and one with a pair of giant oxen painted blue for reasons no one can quite explain. Helen listens politely, seated beside Menelaus, who has already grown fond of adjusting his new cloak in public like it's a character trait. And though the air is festive, you sense the undercurrent of something more, change, maybe, or the quiet before the wild. At midday, a strange visitor arrives, Paris of Troy, younger than you imagined, with a face sculpted like a poet's lie and robes that shimmer in the sun like oil on water. He claims to be a prince, and he carries a smile like a secret, but he also brings a gift unlike any other, a carved apple made of gold, engraved with a message that reads to the fairest. You can already tell this is not going to go well. At dinner, the mood shifts. Paris tells stories of high palaces by the sea, of sailing ships with crimson sails, of prophecies and prizes and promises whispered by goddesses. And though everyone laughs and drinks, Helen laughs a little too softly, drinks a little too slowly, and you notice that she hasn't touched her husband's hand all evening. That night, whispers move faster than the wind. Some say Paris came only for trade talks, others say he's seeking an alliance, but the cook swears he overheard a servant say the Trojan prince has eyes only for the queen. You tell yourself it's ridiculous, just gossip spun by restless minds, but then again, you've seen stranger things. Like the time a Spartan priest insisted his cat spoke fluent Phoenician, or that week last spring when a statue of Artemis started weeping olive oil. Still, something about Paris makes your skin feel too tight. The next few days pass in a fog of protocol and feasts. Paris is everywhere, and always somehow near Helen, whether at the archery range where he conveniently misses every shot until she giggles, or in the temple garden where they both admire a statue of Aphrodite for far too long, and you can't tell if Menelaus notices or if he's simply refusing to see it. Historians still argue whether Helen was seduced or simply stolen, but here, in the flicker of torchlight and the hush of long corridors, it feels more like a spell slowly tightening, like ivy around an old wall. One afternoon, while fetching honey cakes from the storeroom, you pass by the library and hear voices. Helen, soft and uncertain, Paris, low and urgent, and though you catch only fragments, promised, gods, freedom, it's enough to chill your spine. That evening, Helen says little at supper. Menelaus boasts about Spartan bronze exports. Paris excuses himself early. You lie awake for hours, listening to the night hum with secrets, and then, just before dawn, it happens. The palace is still, the guards half asleep, and yet the stable doors creak open, the scent of horses mingling with the salt of the pre-dawn breeze. You sneak through the kitchen, past the sleeping dog curled on the hearth, and reach the outer courtyard just in time to see Paris mounting a Trojan ship, Helen already beside him, her veil fluttering like surrender or defiance or both. You don't call out. Neither does she. You only watch, heart hammering, as the ship slips into the mist, its sails catching the first breath of wind. Behind you, the palace begins to stir. Somewhere, a rooster crows. Somewhere, Menelaus reaches for his wife and finds only warm linen. And somewhere, the gods begin to laugh. You don't sleep that night, and neither does the palace. By sunrise, everyone knows Helen is gone, but no one dares to say it outright. So the hall buzzes with half-sentences and sideways glances, and Menelaus stands at the balcony, hands clenched so tightly around the railing that you're certain he'll snap the marble like dry bread. Yet his voice, when he finally speaks, is calm and cold as the Aegean depths. You, meanwhile, are sent on errands, first to the stables, then to the port, then to the temple of Hera, where the priestess weeps quietly into her incense bowl because she knew, she says, she dreamed it in smoke, and now the smoke has become fire. Menelaus calls a council, and the great hall fills with kings and generals and two very confused poets who were just there for the fig pastries. And while arguments rise and strategies clash, you sit in the corner, peeling an orange and wondering whether this entire mess could have been avoided if someone had just asked Helen how she really felt. But no one does. They speak of honor and vengeance and ships and wars, and never once does her name carry anything soft. That afternoon, the preparations begin, weapons polished, ships loaded, armor fitted for those too young to have any business in armor. And while you help pack amphory of wine beside a boy barely old enough to hold a sword, he turns to you and says, quite cheerfully, "I hope the Trojans have olives." It's absurd and a little heartbreaking, and you laugh despite yourself. Outside, the wind changes. Historians still argue whether the 1,000 ships ever really launched, or whether that number was a poet's invention. But the sight of even a dozen vessels cutting across the wine-dark sea is enough to churn your stomach. You watch Menelaus board the lead ship, his face set like a statue S, and for a brief moment you wonder if he's angry, heartbroken, or simply bored of the palace meals. Then he's gone, and Sparta feels hollow, like a chest exhaling for the first time in years. The days pass slowly. Rumors trickle back from ports and traders. Troy is fortified, the Trojans defiant, Paris still smiling. You find yourself in charge of minor temple duties, which mostly means scaring off goats and refilling lamps, but one evening an old woman comes in, murmurs a prayer for Helen, and leaves a single pomegranate on the altar. You ask why, and she only says, "To remind the gods that beauty is not always sweet." That sticks with you. Another day, you overhear two market women debating whether Aphrodite should be blamed for all this, or if perhaps it was just boredom or fate or something in the wine. You quietly take their side. The wine has been particularly potent this year. Then, a letter arrives, sealed in gold wax and written in a hand you recognize before you even open it. Helen. She writes only a few lines, says she's well, that Paris treats her kindly, that the sea is beautiful when it's not storming, but the last sentence haunts you. "Tell them I wasn't stolen." That night. Stars seem crueler somehow, brighter and sharper, like the sky itself is watching. You start dreaming of swans again, of wings that gleam like moonlight and eyes that know too much. You wake with feathers in your thoughts and the ghost of laughter in your ears. Around you, Sparta grows more brittle, its halls echo too loudly, its people too quiet. The high priestess begins offering sacrifices to Athena for strategy, Ares for blood, Hera for loyalty, and even Poseidon, in case the sea decides to play favorites. You assist with one of these rituals, holding a tray of bay leaves as the priests chant, and you swear the brazier flickers in time with your heartbeat. One evening, a bard visits, young, smug, and wearing far too many rings, but his song is soft, and though it twists facts like thread, you let him play. His lyrics say that Helen's face launched 1,000 ships, but he never mentions that she used to love grape leaves stuffed with mint, or that she once laughed so hard she spilled honey on a sacred scroll. You almost correct him. Almost. Historians still argue whether Helen ever regretted leaving, whether she found love or merely escape. But here, alone in a palace built of marble and memory, you wonder if maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe swans and ships and stolen queens are just the way humans explain wanting something that doesn't belong to them. One night you walk through the olive grove behind the temple, the moonlight brushing the branches like paint, and you find a single feather, white, perfect, untouched by wind or time, and you think maybe, just maybe, the gods are watching after all. You wake up to smoke curling against the pale morning light. Someone's burning old scrolls in the courtyard, not out of malice but ceremony, as if cleansing Sparta of its memories might rewrite the story. But of course, you know it won't. You stroll past the brazier, the scent of myrrh and charred papyrus clinging to your robes, and wonder how many myths were lost to smoke like this, how many truths disguised as poetry, how many lies whispered into permanence. The war has officially begun, though here in Sparta, it feels like an echo, a long, low hum stretching from Troy's golden gates to your quiet morning tasks. Your job today is to catalog gifts left at the shrine: olive oil, woven dolls, bronze charms, and confusingly, a turnip carved into the shape of a horse, which you reluctantly add to the inventory with a shrug. Historians still argue whether this kind of devotion was genuine faith or just superstition clinging like ivy to the crumbling wall of certainty, but you can't deny the comfort of routine. Midday brings a procession. Local farmers and artisans parading up the palace steps with baskets of figs and jars of honey, all to thank the gods for protecting their families while Sparta's warriors chase glory across the sea. One child offers you a handful of acorns and says, "For Zeus, in case he gets hungry," and you pocket them not for Zeus, but because the kid had dimples like tiny shields. In the heat of the afternoon, the high priestess collapses during a ritual, overcome by heat or spirit or maybe just age, and you help carry her to the shade where she murmurs, "The swan returns when no one watches." It doesn't make sense, not yet, but you tuck it away like a seed. That night someone brings news. Agamemnon, Menelaus' brother, has taken command and brought every king and their cousin under one banner, a sea of spears, sails, and ambition marching toward Troy. You try to picture it: the shouting, the gleam of helmets, the sound of sandals slapping against gangplanks. But all you can conjure is Helen, sitting quietly at a window, staring at the same sea and wondering whether her name will ever belong to her again. You dream of her again that night, not as queen or prize or prophecy, but as a girl running barefoot through wet grass, laughing with someone you can't quite see. You wake with your heart beating like a drum. The next day, a wandering philosopher stops by the temple, claims to have spoken to Hermes in a dream, though the only proof he offers is a complicated diagram involving stars, goats, and a surprisingly detailed map of Crete. You sit through his entire explanation mostly because he brought candied dates. Somewhere between celestial goat cycles and quantum turtle shells, he mentions Leda, the mortal queen Zeus seduced in swan form, and muses whether gods fall in love or merely hunger. You don't answer, but you do notice your hands tighten around the candied dates. That evening during cleanup, you find a child's drawing tucked between two prayer scrolls, a big white bird and a girl holding its wing. No words, just lines and crayon-smudged hope. You hang it behind the altar. As autumn creeps in, the palace changes, grapevines sag with fruit, the wind bites more sharply, and people speak less of Helen and more of the harvest. You oversee offerings for Demeter, whose statues always smell faintly of wheat and longing, and who, you suspect, might understand Helen better than anyone. The old woman with the pomegranate returns and leaves a cluster of grapes this time. "She's still a daughter," she says. You nod. And that night you begin to write not a report or an epic, but a letter unsent and unaddressed. You write about the swan, the war, the turnip horse, the philosopher and his stars, the child with the acorns. You write about laughter and longing, and the silence that comes after a name is spoken too many times. You don't know if anyone will ever read it, but you write anyway. You awaken to a hush, the kind that wraps around your limbs like linen soaked in rosewater, and for a moment Sparta feels suspended in amber, paused between breaths, between myth and memory, between the footfall of gods and the quiet prayers of those left behind. Outside your window, the fig trees are heavy, swollen like stories untold, their scent thick in the air, mingling with the distant sound of metal against metal, blacksmiths, sharpening tools for soldiers who haven't yet returned or perhaps never will. You wander through the temple, your sandals whispering over marble like secrets too shy to speak aloud, and pass an old man trying to repair a cracked statue of Athena with melted beeswax and quiet swears under his breath, muttering about divine patience and chipped noses. Today's ritual is simple: a purification for the wine jars, a blessing over the grape press, and a small ceremony for travelers, because it's said that Hermes watches the roads more closely during wartime. You chant the words by memory, your voice joining others like birds in a cypress grove, and as the incense curls toward the rafters, your thoughts drift, uninvited but persistent, back to Leda and her impossible encounter with the Swan. Historians still argue whether the tale is metaphor, vision, or cautionary fable wrapped in feathered charm, but you can't help wondering if there's a fragment of truth hiding beneath the wingspan. A traveling poet recites verses at noon, and though he forgets most of his own lines, he manages one that sticks in your chest. The gods do not disguise themselves to trick us, but because truth would blind us. You hold on to that. That evening, as the sun leans lazily into the horizon, you walk the river path and watch herons skim the water, their wings wide and white against the violet sky, and for a heartbeat you think you see something else. A shimmer, a presence, a ripple in the reeds too smooth to be wind. You don't chase it. You simply sit, knees drawn up, and listen to the frogs begin their songs like drunken priests rehearsing for a festival they forgot was today. Back at the temple, a young girl offers her drawing from yesterday to the gods formally this time, and you watch as she bows with such seriousness it almost makes you cry. For Leda, she says, and you nod as if you know exactly what that means. You place the drawing next to a polished stone and a tiny loaf shaped like a bird, part of a growing shrine that no one talks about, not really, but that everyone contributes to quietly, like an unsent love letter they're afraid might be read aloud. The palace kitchen has begun preparing for winter feasts, drying meats, boiling must for future wine, stringing herbs from the beams like garlands, and you sneak a handful of raisins from a basket while helping the cooks carry in sacks of grain. Offer them to Hestia, one cook jokes, or eat them, same effect. You laugh, but later you leave 2 raisins on the hearth just in case. That night, as you close the temple doors, a small bird flutters inside, trapped, confused, frantic, and you spend nearly an hour coaxing it toward the light, whispering nonsense like, "This way, little one, and you don't belong in here either." When it finally finds the open sky, your shoulders relax in a way they haven't since the war began. Before bed, you pass by the old woman with the pomegranate again. This time she offers no fruit, only a look, a soft, sorrowful glance that makes you feel like she knows more than she lets on. You dream of swans again, but this time they aren't descending gods or secret messengers. They're just birds drifting across a lake, wings folded like letters never opened, and for once you don't wake startled, you wake still. You rise before the dawn today, wrapped in linen that still smells faintly of cedar and last night's incense, and the sky above Sparta is a soft plum bruise stretching toward the mountains, its silence punctuated only by the creak of old wood and the scuffle of sandaled feet across temple steps. As the day of the procession arrives with both ritual gravity and the chaotic energy of a small festival, and as a temple attendant, you've been tasked with overseeing the altar preparations, an honor or a punishment, depending on who you ask, but you take to it with quiet diligence, sweeping ash from the hearth, arranging barley and salt, polishing the bronze cauldron used to boil offerings, all while fielding questions from anxious priests, overly enthusiastic youths in ceremonial tunics, and one irritable goat that simply refuses to be led anywhere peacefully. And through it all, the story of Leda and her strange divine visitation hangs heavy in the air like the lingering echo of a hymn, everywhere and unspoken. The way a town remembers scandal without needing to mention names. And as you grind fresh myrrh into powder, a girl no older than 12 whispers that she heard Zeus now flies overhead at night, disguised not as a swan but as a pale owl, because owls see what we wish to hide, and you nod not because you believe her, but because myths deserve space to breathe, even when they shift into something else entirely. And outside, the streets have begun to fill with garlanded dancers, olive-crowned elders, and a small troupe of actors dressed in feathers and flowing silks, ready to perform a tragicomedy titled When Gods Woo Poorly, which has reportedly been banned 3 times already by priests who found the jokes too clever and the impersonations a little too convincing, though no one dares stop them now, especially not when the entire town seems hungry for distraction. And as the actors rehearse their lines in the temple courtyard, their lead, playing Zeus, naturally slips on a swan mask and caws loudly, eliciting groans and laughter in equal measure, and you're reminded that even sacred stories become satire given enough generations. And yet, as you move through the gathered crowd, you notice an elderly man setting down a clay dish of honey cakes at the base of a statue, murmuring a prayer not to Zeus but to Leda herself, and it strikes you as oddly radical, a quiet rewriting of reverence, a shift in focus from God to mortal. as if he's saying, "I see you," to a woman history too often mythologized beyond her own pain, and you find yourself moved in a way that makes your ribs ache a little. And later, when the procession winds its way through the agora, with drummers thumping out rhythms older than language, with petals raining from rooftops, and with women tossing olive branches into the crowd like blessings or bribes, you find a moment, just one, where time bends, where you feel as though you've stepped into the very breath of history itself. And in that breath, you recall a fringe belief once whispered by a foreign philosopher who visited Sparta in his youth, claiming that Zeus never took the form of a swan at all, that it was merely a dream Leda had after eating a spoiled fig, a dream so vivid it shifted the weave of memory. And while most scholars dismissed the idea as madness, the poet accompanying him claimed that truth and dream often share a root system, and it's just that one grows upward and the other digs down. And perhaps this is what it means to serve in a temple. To hold both roots in your hands and not confuse them for weeds. And as you guide the final group of worshippers through the offering ritual, the girl from earlier tugs your sleeve and gives you a small pebble shaped like a wing. "For Leda," she says again, and you smile, this time truly, because now you understand the ritual beneath the ritual, and as dusk arrives and the feast begins, complete with roasted fish, chickpea cakes, pomegranate wine. And a surprisingly catchy song about Dionysus and misplaced sandals. You let yourself laugh, even dance a little, even if your tunic keeps getting caught on your belt, and no one notices or cares, least of all the actors, who are too busy reenacting the final scene where Zeus gets chased by angry geese. And you think to yourself that maybe myth isn't sacred because it's true, but because it persists, and you fall asleep that night with olive oil still slick on your fingers and a garland half wilted on your brow, dreaming not of gods or swans or even rivers, but of Leda's smile. Imagined, yes, but calm and full of the quiet defiance of someone whose name still stirs offerings long after the feathers have drifted away. You wake to the sharp scent of thyme and ash drifting in through the shuttered windows, the early light barely brushing the stone floor with its pale, sleepy glow, and as you sit up, your body aching from yesterday's dancing and altar work, a strange hush seems to have settled over Sparta, a silence not of absence but of anticipation, as if the very ground is holding its breath, and outside, the streets are unusually empty save for a few robed figures walking slowly toward the hills, carrying baskets of figs. Jugs of wine and oddly shaped masks carved from olive wood, and you remember with a mild flutter in your stomach that today is the sacred play, an invitation-only dusk-to-midnight reenactment of divine moments, hosted on the hillside amphitheater and attended only by those sworn to keep its secrets. And you weren't invited, of course, not officially, but your friend Cleon, who plays the role of Hermes, managed to secure you a spot backstage. Provided you help carry props and swear not to laugh if he forgets his lines again. And so you grab your cloak, throw a fig into your mouth, and make your way past fig trees and grazing goats, up a winding path lined with fennel and wild marjoram, where the amphitheater rises like an old, sleeping god from the earth, its stone steps carved with centuries of names, graffiti, and maybe a few prayers etched by bored actors long ago. And as you arrive, Cleon greets you in half-costume, winged sandals. No pants, and shoves a lyre into your hands, asking you to guard it with your life, which you promise, though you're not entirely sure you remember how to hold it properly. And backstage is a chaos of tunics, feathers, amphory, nervous pacing, and one unfortunate actor whose swan costume has caught fire twice already due to an ill-placed torch. But despite the frenzy, there's a peculiar joy in the air, the kind that smells of oranges and anticipation. And as sunset bleeds across the sky in ribbons of pink and gold, the audience begins to file in silently, seated in concentric rows like ripples in time. And then, with no announcement, no drumbeat, the play begins, first with silence, then with a single flute note high and trembling, and into that note walks a girl dressed in simple white, representing Leda not as queen or consort but as a barefoot girl carrying a bundle of reeds, and she does not speak, only moves slowly, with the weight of a story not yet told. And behind her, masked figures portray her family, the river, the sky, and finally Zeus, as a massive swan puppet manned by 3 actors in tandem, their synchronized steps making the wings ripple like real feathers, and the effect is so eerie, so hauntingly graceful, that the entire hillside seems to lean forward, drawn in by the rhythm of myth made flesh, and you watch, breath caught, as the story unfolds in pantomime and poetry, with bursts of dance, shadow play, and soft chorus singing a lullaby that sounds like rain falling on clay roofs. And though you know the tale, know its complexities and contradictions, something in this version unsettles you, not in fear, but in the way an old memory stirs when it's suddenly told from another voice, And there is a moment, brief but brilliant, when Leda stands alone center stage, holding a broken egg in one hand and a feather in the other, and she looks up, not at Zeus, not at the heavens, but at the audience. And the silence that follows is so absolute you hear the wind shift through the olive trees. And later, as the final scene fades and the actors take their silent bows, the crowd remains still. No clapping, no whispering, just the deep communal exhale of those who have witnessed something that demands more than applause. And Cleon, flushed and triumphant, hugs you tight enough to crack ribs, whispering, "Did you see them cry?" Before laughing and tripping over his winged sandals again. And as the night thickens and people file away down the hill like shadows returning to their roots, you remain, seated on a worn stone, the lyre still in your lap, watching the moon rise above the mountains, and you wonder not for the first time, if the gods ever come to their own plays, hidden among the crowd, leaning close to hear how their stories have twisted, softened, endured, and if perhaps Zeus himself sat in that highest row, silent and unmasked, watching his myth retold by mortals with feathers and fire, and deciding, perhaps, to change nothing, letting the story live as it is, flawed, feathered, and deeply human. You awaken before dawn, the pale gray light seep in. Through cracks in your roof like a whispered warning that today will demand more of you than usual, and you rub your eyes with the back of your hand, still tasting last night's wine and the faint ash of burnt honey cakes from the temple feast, and you stretch your limbs, sore from hours spent watching the amphitheater's divine spectacle and lugging Swan props up and down the hillside, and as you step outside, Sparta feels different, quieter, somehow, as if the myth had slipped from the stage into the soil itself. And the villagers you pass all carry themselves with a strange hush, casting furtive glances at the mountains and muttering to themselves about omens and cracked eggshells found in the fountains. And down near the market, a crowd gathers around a traveling sculptor, an Athenian exile, you're told, who is chiseling a marble statue of Leda, except in his version, she's turning into a swan too, wings unfurling from her shoulders and eyes full of something no one dares name. And while the elders grumble about blasphemy, others are moved to silence, staring so long their olives go unsold and their bread burns at home. And later, when you return to your shared home, your neighbor is standing on the roof adjusting wind charms shaped like feathers. And she tells you that her cousin saw a real swan in the agora this morning, just walking around like it owned the place, nodding at merchants and pecking at fruit stalls, and you laugh mostly. But your smile falters when she says the swan disappeared into thin air, not flew, but vanished. And historians still argue whether ancient Greeks truly believed these sightings or simply enjoyed pretending they did. But either way, the stories spread faster than the truth ever could. And so by evening, you're invited to a secret gathering near the river Eurotas, where musicians and myth lovers plan to reenact not the divine version of the swan story, but the village gossip version, complete with satirical masks and a giant egg-shaped piñata. And when you arrive, the riverbank is strung with garlands and flickering torches, and someone hands you a costume made entirely of white linen napkins and goose feathers, and you can't decide whether you look more like Zeus or a laundry accident. But the mood is light and the flute music jaunty, and in the midst of the festivities, a boy no older than 10 begins telling the story from his own imagination, describing how the swan met Leda while searching for the best olive oil, and how they debated for hours over proper bread-dipping etiquette before falling in love. And everyone laughs so hard someone actually chokes on a grape. And you realize that while temples and statues may enshrine the grand tales, it's these riverside retellings, silly, spontaneous, deeply human, that truly keep the myths alive. And later, under a crescent moon, the egg piñata is cracked open with a stick shaped like a thunderbolt, raining down pomegranate seeds and little wax scrolls with jokes about godly affairs, and someone hands you one that reads, "Even gods ghost you sometimes," and you laugh until your sides hurt, lying back on the cool grass, the scent of crushed herbs and river mist in your nose. And as the crowd disperses, you linger watching two musicians improvise a lullaby about swan courtship rituals, which according to one, involve synchronized swimming and gifting shiny pebbles. Though historians still debate whether that part was metaphor or mating strategy. And as the last torch dims and the river hums its endless lullaby, you feel the story settle deeper into you, not just the myth of Zeus and Leda, but the myth of retelling itself, the quiet revolution of interpretation, of a people's power to take the sacred and make it sweet, silly, and theirs again and again, feather by feather, laugh by laugh, story by story. The sun rises the next morning like it's hungover from the previous night's festivities, sluggish and heavy, casting long sleepy shadows over the fields as you meander past the edge of the olive groves, still clutching a leftover scroll joke in your hand, something about Hera inventing passive aggression. And you pause to watch a pair of white birds flutter across the sky, unsure if they're swans, doves, or simply your imagination filling in the gaps left by the stories you've been swimming in. And as you reach the village square, a new proclamation is being nailed to the wooden pole near the well, its parchment still crisp, the ink still damp, and it declares a week-long observance of feathered reverence, allegedly decreed by the high priest himself, who apparently dreamed that Zeus winked at him from a birdbath, and everyone's now encouraged to wear something avian-themed: feathers, beaks, winged sandals, whatever floats their mythological boat. And so you spend the day watching your neighbors improvise wildly, with some donning full peacock capes and others merely tucking chicken feathers behind their ears, and a goat is dyed white, dubbed official Swan representative, and dragged ceremoniously through the streets while chewing on someone's laurel wreath. And you wonder, as you help hang garlands between two fig trees, how seriously anyone is taking any of this. But then again, maybe seriousness isn't the point. Maybe it's the act of participation that breathes life into myth, and historians still debate how much of ancient Greek ritual was sincere piety versus elaborate performance art. Some scholars arguing that even the oracles played to the crowd, and as afternoon slips into golden hour, you're recruited into a myth relay, where teams race through town carrying giant paper wings and attempting to recite all of Zeus's animal transformations without laughing, which proves impossible by the time someone shouts Golden Shower Goose Edition. And by evening, everyone gathers near the temple for the unveiling of a new fresco, this one painted overnight by the exile sculptor and his sister, who specializes in dramatic clouds, and it depicts Leda mid-transformation, with her hair morphing into feathers and one eye sparkling with starlight while the other stares blankly into eternity, and it's unsettling and beautiful and vaguely humorous all at once, and you overhear one old man mutter, "She looks like she's trying to remember if she left the oven on," and you snort before realizing he's right. And a group of children are trying to replicate the painting in chalk on the stone pavement nearby, but theirs feature sunglasses and speech bubbles, one of which reads, "Swipe right for Godbirds," and you chuckle, remembering that even sacred art becomes playground sketch when filtered through youthful irreverence. And as the sky deepens into velvet and stars begin blinking to life, you drift with the crowd toward the communal fire, where spiced honey wine is passed around in cracked amphorae, and people start sharing their own strange dreams, feathered and otherwise. And a local farmer insists he dreamt of a swan teaching him accounting, while the baker claims hers was about Dionysus turning her bread into fish and making rude jokes about carbs. And you sit, sipping slowly, warmed by the drink and the absurdity, thinking about how myths function not just as stories but as social glue, binding people through shared disbelief and participatory nonsense. And as you lay back once more, the stars overhead swirling like divine breadcrumbs across the night, you wonder if Zeus ever dreamed of being mortal, of sitting by a fire with mortals, laughing not at them but with them, wings off, thunderbolts tucked away, just one more figure in a crowd making fun of his own legends. And as the fire crackles and someone starts humming the same lullaby from last night, you close your eyes and let yourself drift, swaddled in myth and wine and laughter, knowing tomorrow the Swan parade starts at sunrise and that you'll probably be late again. You wake up sprawled across a woven reed mat, the scent of lingering smoke in your hair and the faint imprint of someone's sandal on your cheek from where they must have stepped over you on their way to last night's communal bread pudding contest, which you vaguely recall being judged by an owl that may or may not have been real. And as you stretch, your joints cracking like ancient temple doors, you sit up and realize the Swan parade is already halfway through town. Flutes whistling and children running ahead tossing feathers like confetti, their tunics flapping wildly in the breeze, and you scramble to join them, slipping into a borrowed toga that smells like olives and old poetry. And the moment you step into the dusty street, someone hands you a sign that reads Leda's Support Group, and you're swept into a chaotic sea of participants, some flapping cardboard wings, others dragging long silver ribbons meant to represent divine light or bird droppings. It's unclear. And a trio of older women in matching sandals chant rhythmically, "No more metamorphosis before breakfast," as the parade snakes toward the temple square, where someone set up a mechanical swan puppet that spits out fortune scrolls when you drop in a coin, and yours reads, "You will soon confuse a god for a goose, act surprised." And you tuck it into your sash like a talisman, wondering if the puppet is more accurate than Delphi, since at least it accepts small change, and as you pass the agora, Merchants are hawking swan-shaped pastries, winged helmets, and novelty sandals with built-in beak whistles that honk every third step. And you resist the urge to buy them only because your feet are still sore from the running of the Ganymedes last week. And as the sun reaches its apex, the entire crowd hushes for the unveiling of the Swan Oracle, which turns out to be a woman in white robes and a glittering beak mask seated in a giant nest made of woven laurel branches and grapevines. And she slowly waves one arm in a circle while speaking in an exaggerated cooing voice, saying things like, "The egg of destiny cracks when the time is ripe, and seek feathers within your own heart." And everyone nods sagely, pretending they understand, though one young boy mutters, "She sounds like my aunt on too much oregano." And you can't help but laugh quietly behind your hand. And later that evening, after the parade has dissolved and the feathers have settled into gutters and grapevines, you wander back to the fresco unveiled yesterday, now surrounded by flickering oil lamps and quiet viewers, some whispering prayers, others just staring, and you notice that someone has added a tiny painted duck in the corner, subtle, almost respectful, and no one seems offended. In fact, one priest smiles at it and says, "Even the gods appreciate a good visual pun," which somehow makes you feel better about everything, like the whole mythos is a shared inside joke between mortals and immortals, where both sides pretend not to be amused. And as twilight falls, you find yourself seated at a long communal bench where bread, olives, roasted figs, and a sweet cheese tart are being passed around along with goblets of cool pomegranate wine. And someone tells the story of how Leda's daughter Helen once tried to organize an all-women poetry festival and accidentally started the Trojan War. And someone else argues that actually Helen was just a scapegoat for poor diplomacy. And historians still debate whether she ever really left Sparta, or if it was just her eidolon, a divine copy created to fool everyone, while the real Helen waited out the war in Egypt, eating dates and avoiding drama, and the debate dissolves into sleepy laughter as someone drops an olive pit down their tunic and can't find it. And as you lean back, belly full, skin sticky with wine and sunset, you feel something brush your shoulder and glance up to see a lone feather drifting down from the rooftops, catching the last light like a tiny torch. And you smile, deciding not to wonder whether it's just a pigeon's or something more poetic, because sometimes you realize myth lives best in not knowing, in the warm glow of maybe. And as the stars return, their ancient constellations twinkling like breadcrumbs across the sky, you trace the curve of Cygnus, the celestial swan, and let yourself be carried once more on the soft wings of sleep. You awaken in the soft cradle of dawn, your head cushioned on a rolled-up goatskin, and the scent of ash, thyme, and last night's honeyed wine lingering in the air, as if the gods themselves had brewed dreams into vapor. And as you slowly sit up, joints cracking like old amphory lids, you realize someone has drawn a chalk swan on your forearm during the night with the words, "Zeus was here again," scrawled in looping Ionian script. And though you should probably be concerned, you're far too used to these divine prank calls to be surprised anymore, so you stretch your limbs like an ankh. Each statue slowly returning to life, step into the dew-drenched grass, and head toward the temple baths where early risers are already gossiping about the swan's appearance yesterday. Some say it was divine, others claim it was just a very confident bird wearing laurels, and one old priest insists it was just a tax collector in disguise. And the water is warm, scented faintly with lavender and fig leaves. And as you sink in, the warmth seeps into your bones like sunlight on marble. And the others around you chat lazily, one reciting a riddle supposedly from the Oracle of Dodona, another telling the tale of a painter who once tried to depict the moment Zeus became a swan, but gave up after 4 attempts and painted a loaf of bread instead, claiming symbolism is better than feathers. And somewhere across the courtyard, you hear flutes begin to play slow, sleepy tunes that sound like birdsong translated through silk. And soon a group of children in swan masks begin practicing a dance, leaping and spinning with the chaos of joy and jelly-filled bread. And you decide to follow them, because why not? And the moment you do, a breeze catches the edge of your robe and tosses it like a sail, guiding you down a narrow alley lined with frescoes of other mythic transformations. Europa and the bull, Danae and the golden rain, Io and her long bovine stare, all rendered in rich ochres and faded vermilion. Their eyes half-lidded like they know something you don't. And as you walk, a scholar with scrolls tucked under one arm offers you a roasted chestnut and says, "Historians still argue whether Leda truly embraced the swan, or if the swan was simply how the story was later painted, too awkward to draw Zeus every time." And you chew slowly, nodding, wondering how many myths are just artistic shortcuts, and you arrive at a small circular shrine covered in ivory feathers, with a single marble egg on a pedestal. said to be a replica of the one from which Helen hatched, though no one can confirm whether that egg was goose-sized or dragon-sized, depending on the poet, and around it, people leave tiny offerings. Glass beads, love poems, half-eaten pastries, feathers plucked from pillows, and you find yourself adding your chalk-drawn forearm to the collection, pressing it against the marble so the swan doodle transfers faintly to the cold stone, and someone behind you whispers, "He's always leaving marks," and you don't know if they mean Zeus, time, or the artist who keeps tagging everything with swans, and as the sun climbs higher. You join a symposium already deep in discussion over whether Helen was truly Leda's daughter or Nemesis's, since some versions claim it was Nemesis who laid the egg after being chased by Zeus in swan form while transforming into various animals to escape him, including a fish, a weasel, and at one point a tree, which raises the question, how exactly do you lay an egg as a tree? And no one really answers, but the debate rolls on, wrapped in laughter and clay cups of diluted wine, and someone begins reciting from memory a lost fragment of Saf, half remembered and half invented, something about wings and longing and footsteps in dew, and everyone nods as if it's gospel, though no one's quite sure if it's real. And as evening begins to unfurl her robes across the sky, you find yourself staring at the fading chalk on your arm, thinking of Leda, not as a victim or a symbol, but as a woman who woke up with feathers in her hair and a story no one would quite believe. And maybe she laughed, or maybe she wept, or maybe, like you, she just got up, made breakfast, and wondered how to wash swan off silk. You rise before dawn the next day, the horizon a lazy line of plum and gold, and as you lace your sandals, still slightly damp from yesterday's unexpected swan chase, you notice that a single ivory feather has stuck to the side of your tunic, and though you try to brush it away, it clings like a bad poem or a persistent god. So you leave it, feeling oddly marked, and step into the quiet marketplace where the air is thick with the scent of baked barley, sun-warmed olives. And last night's incense still trailing out of doorways like forgotten thoughts, and merchants are already setting up their stalls, muttering about omens and geese while unraveling bolts of deep violet linen. And in one corner, a bronze mirror seller is telling a half-interested customer about the time Narcissus fell in love with his own reflection, swore he saw Zeus in it, and accidentally married his own shadow, which you're pretty sure is not the canonical version. But you nod anyway, because at this hour, everyone's half a myth, and as you wander through the agora, a boy offers you a carved toy swan with wheels on its feet and eyes made from black tourmaline, and when you decline politely, he says, "Don't worry, he always comes back," which you hope refers to the toy and not Zeus, though with that god it's never clear, and just beyond the temple scent. A small crowd gathers around a traveling philosopher who's gesturing wildly with a wine cup in one hand and a laurel branch in the other, arguing that swan metamorphosis was Zeus's attempt to escape divine accountability, a literal whitewashing of misdeeds, and you can't help but smile because someone in the back shouts, "Let him who has never shape-shifted cast the first stone." And the crowd laughs like a sleepy choir, and the debate rolls on, touching everything from divine consent to the ethics of bird impersonation to whether feathers are more poetic than lightning bolts. And behind you, a group of actors rehearse a tragicomedy about Leda's bathhouse dream in which the swan is a misunderstood librarian just trying to return a lost scroll. And each time the swan enters, someone plays a single mournful note on a lyre, and it's somehow both ridiculous and deeply moving. Like all the best myths, and as the sun continues its climb, you follow a mosaic path that depicts the life cycle of a swan, from egg to sky to death to constellation. And halfway through, you pause at the panel where the swan turns into a cluster of stars, because it reminds you that in some versions, Zeus places his feathered disguise in the sky as a kind of divine trophy or celestial apology, and someone nearby, maybe a student or a bard, says. Historians still argue whether Cygnus is meant to be Zeus, or just a reminder that gods too get lonely. And you sit on a low marble bench beside a fountain shaped like a lotus, and watch an older woman carefully painting a swan onto a ceramic cup, her brush slow and steady, as she hums a lullaby that mentions Leda's name once, softly like a secret. And the cup is beautiful, all teal and gold and feathered edges, and she tells you she's been painting the same swan for 40 years. Each one slightly different, depending on her dreams, and you ask if she thinks the story really happened, and she shrugs and says, "All myths are just truths wrapped in poetry," and goes back to painting. And you sit a while longer watching pigeons try to land gracefully on a bronze statue's slippery shoulders, and think that perhaps being remembered, even as a bird, is better than fading into silence, and just before noon, you find yourself back at the Temple of Hera, where the priests are preparing for the Festival of Molting, a celebration of transformation where everyone wears masks and trades names for a day, and a young girl with silver wings invites you to write your wish on a strip of papyrus and tie it to a willow tree said to have once shaded Leda's dreams. And you write, not quite knowing what you're asking for. And as you tie your message to the lowest branch, a breeze lifts the paper slightly, and you could swear the tree sighs, and the girl says, "He always listens on festival days." And you smile, though you're not sure if he is Zeus, the tree, or some mischievous local priest, and you wander toward the procession forming in the square. Musicians tuning lyres, dancers donning feathered cloaks, and someone wearing an enormous papier-mâché swan head that bobs comically as they practice curtsies, and the whole thing feels more like a dream than a ritual. But then maybe that's the point, and as the festival begins, you're swept into a slow, circling dance that feels ancient and oddly familiar, like you've done this before in another life or another myth, and someone hands you a cup of pomegranate wine and whispers, "Don't spill, he hates that," and you laugh, careful not to, and as the sun tips westward, casting long shadows like fingers across the flagstones, the dancers raise their arms in imitation of wings, and for a moment the entire city seems to lift, just slightly, just enough to make you believe that gods, swans, and mortals might all be capable of flight. You wake the next morning with the taste of pomegranate still faintly on your tongue and the ghost of feathers brushing your dreams. And though your head is heavy with the aftereffects of wine and storytelling, the city feels different today, lighter, quieter, like a stage cleared after the final act. Yet the scent of crushed lilies and burnt myrrh still lingers in the air, a soft reminder that even fleeting celebrations leave their trace. And as you step into the narrow alley behind your lodgings, you find a delicate trail of white feathers leading toward the harbor, where ships sit fat and sleeping in the calm tide, their sails furled like folded wings, and something in you tugs forward, a feeling like nostalgia for something you haven't yet experienced. And as you follow the trail, a boy with olive-stained fingers offers you a fig, saying it's sworn by the swan, and when you laugh, he shrugs and mutters, "Zeus pays better in feathers than coins," which frankly sounds about right for divine accounting. And you keep walking until you reach the shoreline, where fishermen mend their nets while humming songs about Leda's beauty, their voice. Ces soft like lullabies, and one of them gestures at the sky and says, "That cloud looks like a swan with a crown," and indeed it does, puffed and proud above the horizon, as if Zeus is still showing off. Centuries later and nearby, an old priest with sun-cracked skin and a voice like gravel reads from a scroll he claims was penned by Orpheus himself, detailing a version of the myth where Leda never meets Zeus, but instead finds a wounded swan by the riverbank and nurses it back to health, only for it to become a constellation out of gratitude. And while the authenticity is dubious at best, the image sticks with you, and as the priest finishes, he leans close and whispers, "Historians still argue whether Leda ever existed, or if she was simply a symbol for the way mortals romanticize power," and you nod slowly, because that feels true somehow, like the kind of thought you'd only admit to the sea. And when you reach the edge of the water, you notice a curious group of stones arranged in the shape of a feather, half buried in the sand, and when you brush one clean, you discover a carved inscription, "To the god who forgets he is human," which feels like either a warning or a compliment, depending on your mood, and a wandering bard nearby strums a lyre and begins singing about Leda's daughters, Helen, Clytemnestra, and how some believed they hatched from eggs, while others thought they were born from the echoes of Hera's jealousy, and the lyrics shift, dreamlike, suggesting that perhaps there were no daughters at all. Only stories woven into flesh by desperate poets needing to explain why wars start over beauty. And as the tide begins to rise, you walk along the rocks where seabirds squabble over a half-eaten eel, and one particularly large gull seems to be wearing a glinting piece of gold tied to its leg, which upon closer inspection turns out to be a tiny medallion shaped like a thunderbolt. And you think, is that you again, Zeus? Have you moved on from swans to seagulls now? And the gull caws indignantly and flaps away, leaving only a single feather in its wake, which you pick up and tuck behind your ear, because why not lean into the absurdity, and you climb a small hill overlooking the harbor where someone has etched scenes into the rock. Leda bathing, the swan circling, an egg cracking open, a woman standing alone at the edge of a battlefield, and beside it a recent addition in fresh red paint. Myths are mirrors, not windows, and beneath that a smaller phrase. But some of us like what we see, and you sit there for a while, letting the wind tangle your hair and the gulls cry overhead, watching the ships drift lazily like tired gods retreating into dreams. And for a moment, you close your eyes and try to imagine what it must have felt like to have a god fall from the sky in the shape of beauty and burden all at once, to be both chosen and condemned in a single encounter. And though you can't quite feel it, you sense its shape, the weight of it. Like a story you're told before bed that makes you smile and shiver at the same time. And as the sun begins to slide west, casting everything in soft amber, a voice behind you says, "Want to hear my version?" You turn to find an old woman balancing a basket of eggs and honeycakes, her eyes bright with mischief. And she sits beside you and begins a tale where Leda is actually the one who shape-shifts. Into a swan, into a queen, into a shadow, and Zeus is the one caught off guard, charmed by her refusal to be impressed. And in this version, it is Leda who flies away, leaving only a trail of laughter and feathers in her wake. And when the woman finishes, she pats your knee and says, "There's always more than one truth." And you believe her, because how could you not, in a world where swans wear crowns, gods steal shapes, and myths grow like vines around the pillars of history, wrapping everything in feathered uncertainty and soft, silvery lies. You wake the next morning in a village tucked between olive groves and low hills, a place not marked on most maps and known mostly by storytellers who remember to whisper rather than shout. And as you rise from the creaky cot in your rented room, you spot an old tapestry on the wall, faded but unmistakably depicting a woman cradling a swan, though whether she's protecting it or offering it to the gods isn't clear, and you dress slowly. Scent of rosemary and sun-dried figs wafting through the wooden shutters, and downstairs the innkeeper greets you with a sleepy nod and a cup of something hot and cinnamon-laced, muttering, "Be careful today, the old stories tend to walk on festival days," which is exactly the kind of ominous folklore warning you were hoping for. And as you step into the village square, everything hums with the early tremble of celebration. Banners swaying in the breeze, stalls packed with embroidered shawls and honeyed pastries. Children wearing swan feather masks that seem too realistic to be from craft. Tea stores and a procession of women in white robes preparing for what a local elder calls the Day of the Veiled Queen, which apparently honors not just Leda, but every woman in myth who wasn't given a voice loud enough to shout back at the gods. And you walk among the bustle, pausing to watch a troupe of dancers in slow, synchronized circles mimicking the flapping of wings, while a blind musician strums a lyre and sings a ballad in a dialect you don't fully understand but which still seems to translate directly to your bones. And near the fountain, someone has placed an offering, a cracked eggshell filled with rose petals and silver coins, and beside it, a note written in looping script. For the story we pretend didn't happen, which makes you pause and sip your drink more slowly, because even when the stories are absurd, there's always something under the surface that feels far too human. And across the plaza, an old man selling ink drawings insists on telling you his personal theory, that Leda was never seduced, never tricked, but instead struck a deal with Zeus for her daughter's futures, playing the long game while the gods preened and postured. And he gestures toward a painting of Helen with a golden thread wrapped around her wrist, explaining, "It's not a leash, it's a lasso." And then he winks, as if you've both been let in on some shared mischief the rest of the world missed, and you move on, carrying the image with you like an uninvited but oddly welcome companion. And as the parade begins, with masks and feathers and theatrical retellings of the swan myth performed atop wooden carts, you hear one performer shout, "Not all feathers are soft." And not all stories are gentle, which earns polite applause and a few confused looks from nearby tourists, but it rings in your ears longer than expected, and you find a shady spot beside a laurel tree where a local historian offers you a sticky scroll and says, "Read this." It's a version where Leda writes her own epic after Zeus leaves, and yes, it's probably fake, but aren't they all? And when you unroll it, you discover not an epic poem but a series of letters, first to her daughters, then to Helen's lovers, then to Zeus himself, none of them asking for forgiveness, but all of them demanding honesty, and one particularly sharp line stands out. "I was not visited, I was seen and then forgotten." And you fold the scroll back up with trembling fingers, because that's the kind of truth that doesn't sleep well at night. And as the sun crests its peak, you follow the crowd toward the edge of town, where a ceremonial swan-shaped float is being pulled into the river and gently set adrift, and everyone gathers on the shore in silence, watching it glide toward the horizon like a prayer too quiet for the gods to hear, and a child beside you asks, "Do you think she was happy?" And no one answers because really, how do you measure happiness in a myth where everything is half symbol, half truth, and entirely fogged by time? And just as you turn to leave, a small commotion erupts near the water's edge. Someone has spotted a real swan, not part of the ceremony, gliding alongside the float like it was summoned by memory alone. And for a heartbeat, the village stills, breath held in that strange space between wonder and worry, and then someone whispers, "She came." And no one corrects them, because maybe it's nicer not to. And as the crowd disperses and the music resumes in softer tones, you walk uphill to a tiny shrine tucked into a crumbling wall, where offerings have been left. Lipstick, bronze mirrors, a broken sandal, and an unmarked feather, and on the wall behind them, etched deeply into the stone, is a message in ancient Greek that roughly translates to, "Even swans deserve witnesses," which makes you smile not because it's comforting, but because it feels like someone somewhere remembered what it meant to see without controlling, to love without erasing. And as the evening settles in, you sit beneath an olive tree sipping something herbal and strong, watching the sky turn golden, and for a moment you swear the clouds above form wings, not descending this time, but rising, pulling away from the earth like smoke from a fire that has finally cooled. You wake before the sun and step outside as the first blush of morning filters through the olive branches, casting long, sleepy shadows over the stone path. And today your feet lead you uphill, farther from the town and its slowly fading festival, toward a place you overheard mentioned last night in whispers. The old temple, the one no longer listed on official maps, a site reclaimed by weeds and bird calls but still stubbornly there, and the trail is narrow, winding between thickets of laurel and myrtle. Your sandals catching on gnarled roots, your breath slow and visible in the crisp air, and halfway up you pass a mossy statue, headless, weather-worn, and barely recognizable except for the curled tail feathers carved into the base, and though no plaque survives, you just know, in the quiet certainty of myth-saturated places, that it once depicted the god in his feathered lie, and the oddest thing happens. A bird, not a swan, but a plump village pigeon, perches atop the statue and coos at you like it's been waiting for centuries just to say, well, it's about time. And as you continue, the temple ruins reveal themselves, pillars broken and half sunken into the earth, ivy curling like question marks around the old altar, and scattered around the stones are bits of broken ceramics, the remnants of offerings or feasts, or possibly just the results of clumsy archaeologists who gave up before the sun set. And you step carefully past an engraving on a fallen slab depicting two women, one looking skyward, the other looking into a mirror, both barefoot, both impossibly familiar. And beside them, scratched in smaller, rougher lines, a later hand has written, "She did not cry," and you wonder who they meant. Leda or Helen or someone else entirely, someone who bore the story and refused to be rewritten in soft pencil. And you walk further in to the heart of what was once the sanctuary, where a shallow pool reflects the sky perfectly, undisturbed by wind or insects. And in that mirrored water you see your face, yes, but also something else. An outline not quite swan, not quite man, but flickering between both like a candle caught in two breezes, and you blink and it's gone. But the air remains thick with that quiet electric charge myths leave behind, and nearby, nestled between stones, you find a charm. A tiny carved egg, barely bigger than a coin, warm to the touch despite the cool morning air, and etched with feathers so fine you almost mistake them for cracks, and against better judgment you pocket it, because some things are too strange to ignore, and as you descend the hill the world feels subtly different, like the story has rethreaded itself and you're no longer outside it but trailing in its wake, and back in the village people are already clearing the decorations, packing away the masks and folding the banners. But when you pass the innkeeper, she gives you a long, appraising look and says, "You went up, didn't you?" And when you nod, she just mutters, "Careful. The ones who look always end up part of it." And you chuckle, but then notice she's not smiling, and later, sitting under the vine-covered pergola with your afternoon drink, you start to jot down what you've seen, the pool, the engraving, the impossible reflection. And you notice that your handwriting loops differently now, more curved, more fluid, like feathers sketching across the page, and you wonder what else has shifted while you weren't paying attention. And at twilight, you walk down to the river where the ceremonial swan float vanished yesterday, and you spot a child playing with paper boats, one of which bears a tiny drawing of a woman kissing a bird, and you ask him where he learned that story, and he says, "My grandma told me." She said the swan was never the point, and runs off before you can ask more, leaving you there with your half-full notebook and your very full brain. And across the river, a pair of real swans glide silently into view, heads high, feathers pristine, eyes unblinking. And for a second the whole world goes quiet, No birds, no breeze, just that still tension of a story nearing its final act. And as the sun sinks low, you begin to walk again. Unsure of where exactly you're headed, but certain it's the right direction. Because now everything feels like an echo, each stone a whisper, each shadow a wink. And by the time you reach the edge of town, the stars are out, and they're bright enough to trace a shape in the sky that looks suspiciously like wings stretched wide, or maybe arms reaching for something just out of frame, and you lie down in the grass, staring upward, letting the whole weight of the myth settle into your chest, not as burden but as gravity. Gentle and inevitable, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice, yours, hers, his, murmurs, even gods get tired. And for once you believe it, because tonight the stars aren't watching, they're resting, and so are you. You wake in the middle of the night, not startled or sweating or gasping, just aware, as if something in the air shifted gently and nudged your senses. And the room is silent except for the soft breathing of distant neighbors and the far-off rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze that doesn't reach your window. And you get up, because of course you do, and step out into the courtyard barefoot on cold stone, your body moving as if drawn by some leftover filament of story not yet burned out. And above you the moon is full, high, and too bright for sleep, casting everything in silver. The vines, the well, the old cat curled like a question mark near the wall, and you look up, half expecting to see something impossible, a shadow in the stars, a shape with wings, but there's only sky, vast and uncaring, and yet you smile, because it feels like it knows you now, or at least recognizes the path you've walked, and you sit right there on the step, and let the stillness wrap around you like an old cloak, remembering everything. The swan and the girl and the mirror and the temple and the pool and the tiny egg still warm in your pocket. And somewhere in the rustling night, a low hum begins, not mechanical, not human, more like the chorus of wind through feathers or the sigh of myths at rest, and you let it in, let it fill your chest, and your eyes drift shut not out of tiredness but surrender. And now, as the narrative begins to soften and blur at the edges, this is your final glide across the surface of sleep. The moonlight painting lazy spirals on your skin, the cool earth grounding your breath, the slow arc of the night folding gently over your limbs like wings tucking themselves in for the last time tonight. And as your thoughts untangle and float, a few truths remain. Zeus never said sorry, Helen never asked to be born, and Leda, she was more than anyone ever wrote down. And whether you dream of feathers or fire or simple darkness, it doesn't matter, because now you've walked through the myth, not as a reader, but as a ghost guest, and the tale will carry you the rest of the way home. So now here you are, drifting slowly at the edge of dreams, where even the weight of memory feels feather-light, and the rhythm of your breath is the only thing that matters, gentle and steady like waves folding softly against a distant shore. There's nothing left to figure out, no riddles to solve, just the hush that comes after the last page turns, and as your limbs grow heavier, they seem to melt into the world around you, warm and still, supported by every story that's ever been told. And every one that never needed to be, and in the distance, you might still hear the faintest echo of wings, or perhaps the echo is only in your chest, a flutter that's not fear, not excitement, just quiet, satisfied knowing, the kind that comes when the gods have said their piece and left you exactly where you're meant to be, in between what's real and what's dreamed, safe and suspended, as if the stars have pulled a blanket over the sky just for you. And the swan, wherever he is now, glides silently on, not watching, not judging, simply moving forward into that deep velvet dark that swallows everything gently, eventually lovingly. And so you follow, not with steps, not with sound, but with stillness. Slipping beneath the surface of sleep like mist curling into a valley, seamless, complete and undisturbed. And the last thing you feel before your consciousness fades entirely is softness. Beneath you, around you, within you, and then nothing but peace.